and this is a Prezi presentation on nurturing a positive teacher-student relationship. It is the activity for Teach Now Module 4, Unit 1, Activity 1. So let's get started. So first of all, one of the first things is my general background. My name is Stephanie Zhao. I was born in the US. I was born in Iowa. We don't talk about that. I was raised in Michigan. My family is Taiwanese American, and I am a first generation. I am a bit obsessed with languages, so I do speak four languages fluently: English, Mandarin, Taiwanese, and Japanese. And I absolutely love food. I have so far found nothing that I have been afraid to try. This includes balut. If you know what balut is, then you might know what that actually is. And I also love durian, and I love natto. And my hobbies include scuba diving, needle felting, reading, gaming, and badminton. So a little bit of an introduction to my professional background. I graduated from University of Michigan. I majored in English Lit, Asian Studies, and Japan Studies. Yeah, I didn't really sleep a lot then. I attended graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, and I attained 2 masters in TESOL and secondary education. I've taught in Japan for 3 years. I taught in Philadelphia for 2 years, taught in Singapore for 4 years, and I'm currently teaching in Taiwan. So at this point, I'm in my 10th year of teaching. So it's been quite a long run. So let's discuss a little bit about how, as a teacher, I work. I work to create a decent and supportive classroom. So my classroom student demographic is primarily middle school students. Generally, they're 6th to 8th grade. They are usually of affluent background due to the fact that I typically teach in international schools. They often grow up with multiple helpers or nannies. Parents are actually frequently busy with work. They're absent or indifferent, sadly, and they often move regularly. So this is actually quite common. So we do see a lot of movement into the school and outside of the school, even in the middle of the year. So this moves on to our cultural background. So the students usually, so in my previous schools, the students are international, and the majority of them possess multiple passports. They're often from mixed families or interracial families, so they're quite a mixed bunch, and they commonly speak multiple languages already. So my current students are primarily Taiwanese. However, they've also lived overseas internationally for a brief time. Unfortunately for these kids, their English exposure is only in the classroom, although what I've discovered is that in my time as a teacher, to be honest, regardless of their language ability, the way you connect with the kids is pretty much the same. So let's go on to how I plan to do that. So in the first day of class, I always give self-introductions. I like to have some general get-to-know-you points. I always have them share an interesting fact about themselves. I also do some student assessments. This is for myself as a teacher, especially, for example, learning preferences, where they stand now academically, at least in my class, which is English, reading and writing, and also some general background questions. So I always go through and I read them very carefully, and I will actually refer to them regularly after that class, so the kids know that not only do I make them answer those random questions, but I actually do refer back to them and I apply what I know from them to their lives. So after that, I set expectations. So this is where I set my boundaries. I find that if I don't do that in the first day of school, I just get chaos, and it's pretty difficult to tighten boundaries when you start off quite open. So I prefer the opposite. So I usually try to be quite strict in the beginning of the school year. So this is where I set academic expectations. So basically when they should turn in homework, etc. I also set behavioral expectations. This is usually the typical thing. I usually refer to this student guideline book that each school has. Because of my subject area, I also define plagiarism, especially for kids who come from cultures where plagiarism isn't as strictly defined or understood. So I also have my personal and the school discipline policy, and I'm always very, very clear about what the steps are taken, if a student makes a mistake several times, how it will escalate in terms of severity. So this lets the students know that in this case, this is what to expect. It's usually pretty heavy. but I try and speed through it. However, I do feel like this is really, really necessary. And in fact, later on, I generally get a bit of gratitude from the kids who appreciate that I am so clear. Um, but then, I always try and loosen it up. So I do have humor to ease nerves. I am a pretty weird person, so I'm always myself. My students often say that I'm quite immature, which is okay. I make outrageous statements, especially since I always teach the younger kids, and they really like it for some odd reason. For example, I am a dragon that eats children, or my heart is a black hole that requires the tears of children to feel fulfilled. Usually, I develop this especially for my younger sets, because they usually enter sixth grade pretty nervous or afraid, especially when they're seeing a new teacher that they never met. And for some odd perverse reason, every time I make these really dark jokes, they actually relax. So I also often tell amusing stories, and I demonstrate that I find both them, myself, and the day, usually, generally speaking, amusing and enjoyable. I do enjoy teaching class. I love my subject. I very rarely dislike a child, and usually it's for an extreme reason. But I think it's good for them to see that I'm a cheerful, happy person, and that shows in my classroom. So another thing that I also do is I also try and do some room decorations. So if you take a look here, I try to make it as welcoming as possible. So, for example, my desk arrangements are rarely those standard high school rows. I do not like those. I really like to have my kids to be encouraged to do group work and discussion. So that's usually how I arrange my desks. I also have a very, very personal desk. So on my teacher's desk, I always have interesting knickknacks for kids to pick up and examine. I often have a row of things that I call my nerd traps. So these are usually references to video games that I play or things that I love, for example, Harry Potter. And I try and look out for those kids who recognize or get excited by them, or even if they ask questions about it, because it's a great conversation starter. It lets them know that I'm human. And also, the kids are often fascinated by it. And I also make sure that my walls are covered with bright colors, posters, and decorations, but that I allow empty space for the students to work so that they know that they are also responsible for making this classroom theirs. So it's not just my classroom, it's also their classroom. So that's something that I consider to be very important. All right, so let's move on. So the way I try and maintain the good relationship throughout the year is by forging connections. So I often interact with students outside of class. So when I see them in the hallway, I'll say hi, I'll give them a high five, I'll talk to them about what's going on. I ask them about their daily lives, what their weekend plans are, other classes, how they're doing. I take time to attend their extracurriculars. So last year, a lot of my students were in the basketball team, so I would go in and I watch their competitions. I also, because I do play sports with the teachers after school, occasionally the students would join in, and that's actually quite fun as well. So the kids get to see that. I also do consistent enforcement, so I follow through. So with the boundaries that I set earlier, I am very, very consistent. So whatever I say, I will do. I don't make empty threats. I don't do empty gestures. So I continue to remind students of consequences, and I also give them plenty of time to turn things around. I avoid favoritism. I mean, there are some kids who are just really cute, and I really want to give them that exception, but my kids basically need to know that the rule applies to everyone, regardless of how cute they are. So then we move on to this idea of the growth mindset. So this is something that has been showing up in both our cohort conversations and discussions, but it's something that I've actually been applying for quite a while. So I work with students with the understanding that they're all learning and growing, and that no child is inherently bad or good, whether as a person or any subject, really. So I expect improvement to occur gradually. And because, I mean, they're kids, so they're going to make mistakes, they're going to fall back, and that's okay. What I do like to do instead is I actually involve the students in how to strategize and plan to prevent or to improve themselves. So if a kid keeps forgetting to turn in homework, I'll just talk to them and say, okay, well, let's talk about some ways that we can do to prevent that. What makes you forget, right? And I also acknowledge and I encourage every instance of improvement or an attempt, really, even if it's unsuccessful, because, hey, you know what? We're all human. And as an adult, I don't expect perfection from myself. So why would I expect that from my students? So let's move on. So basically, these are the ways that I maintain these good relations with my students. Basically, going back to the boundaries again, I try and be that stable and secure person. So the kids always know what to expect from me. I'm not unpredictable. I don't suddenly like punish everyone for no reason just because I'm in a foul mood. I don't reward everyone just because I'm in a good mood. Um, Basically, I have clear expectations and guidelines. The kids, when they come into my classroom, they know what to expect. They know Miss Zhao wants us to sit down and do some silent reading, or Miss Zhao wants us to do some exercises in our writing notebooks. I always have a set schedule for them so that they understand what it is to be expected. And actually, I mean, it just makes the classroom run faster. So aside from having a good student teacher interaction, it's also just more efficient. I'm also clear and consistent in what is considered acceptable and unacceptable. So again, assignments and behavior, as always, no empty threats. Follow through. Don't unless it's a joke, right? I mean, I sometimes threaten to eat and devour my students because I'm a dragon, but the kids know that that's my humor. So this moves on to the fact that aside from the expectations, I'm also pretty transparent. I am actually really huge on this. I don't like mysteries or secrets. I am not the type of person to say, you guys do things because I said so. In fact, as a kid, I really hated that. And so I try not to do that for the kids because, again, they're people. They're stuck in my classroom for an obscene amount of time. So I always explain to students what the activity is intended to teach them or to help them accomplish and how they can use it in the future. I also introduce grading rubrics and guidelines before assignments so that the kids know exactly what I am asking of them. And I also refer back to the rubrics and guidelines regularly. In fact, one of the things that I love doing is I actually have the kids grade each other with those rubrics even before the final product is due so that they have an idea and that they are more familiar with the rubrics instead of just thrusting them with a sheet of paper and saying, follow this. So, and I always direct the students back to the learning objective so that they know that they're not just learning everything in a space. There's actually a context for which they are learning. So this moves on to my next one. So again, I try and keep it professional. So again, don't take things personally. I try to remind myself, I mean, I have a hot temper, but I remind myself that their mistakes, they're not a mark against me. And when students misbehave, it's not a personal attack. Not everything is intended to be disrespectful. And instead of saying, oh my gosh, you're disrespecting me, I just rather use it as a teaching moment instead of just general scolding. So, and when I do lose my temper, I acknowledge that it is my mistake. And I think one of the most difficult things for a lot of teachers is to sort of bend your head a little bit and acknowledge that, hey, I made a mistake. And to create a classroom where kids know that, hey, mistakes are okay to make so long as you try and improve the next time. I think that helps with their security with me as a teacher as well. Again, I also try to communicate high expectations, but also to make it attainable. This was actually an issue in my previous school where teachers were expecting kids to complete high school level work when the kids were only 11 years old. So this is something that I actually had to set the other teachers in my department to do as a department head at the time. I actually asked them to research what to expect from the age group that they are teaching. Because, I mean, although we do have exceptions, I mean, some kids are phenomenal learners and some of them are way above their grade level. However, you do have to be able to make sure that they all achieve it. Having a high expectation doesn't mean that, only some of the elite can achieve it. It should be something that everyone can achieve if they work hard. So that's something that I try to make sure of. And then at the very end, you just have to care about your students. I'm not actually sure how this is a strategy, although if you don't like students, if you don't like your kids, I don't really know why you're teaching. I celebrate their quirks. I love it when they do weird things, especially when they do weird things. I always ask after their families, friends, and interests, and I interact with them beyond the classroom. So I don't just teach the subject, but I also try and connect with social issues, ethics, morals, and everyday choices. So the kids know that it's not just they're learning it because they have to. For me as a teacher, I'd rather that they come out of my classroom being a better person and knowing that someone cares about them rather than having them know what a setting conflict is. Although those are important, but I want them to know at the end of the day that, they're better people, they care about each other, and that everybody else matters. So this concludes basically my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. It was really enjoyable speaking with us, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I know I sort of rushed it a little bit, but I only have 15 minutes. So that's about it. Thank you, and goodbye.